Good evening all, audio check. In come the masses. We'll get rolling in just a second, everybody. Great to see you. Great to see lots of familiar names. Thanks for joining us. Perfect. We'll get rolling in just a minute here, guys. Happy Monday. Couple key pieces as we get rolling. Hundreds of people registered for this evening, so looking forward to having a great interactive session. So as everybody's logging in, Q&A is opened. Many of you have spoken to me, but keeping this as interactive as possible keeps things fun and light and interactive. So feel free to use Q&A as we go. And also the notes. We're going to be going through with some polls, but in the chat, feel free to post where you're coming from this evening. We are North America wide this evening. So post on in there, let us know where you're joining us from. And we've got some great stuff to run through. So Q&A is open. Tonight is a CE course. And we will be, for those of you collecting CEs, we will be processing that about 10 business days afterwards for the live attendees, not for the recordings yet. Perfect. All right, let's get rolling. First of all, thanks so much. It is a true privilege. It's been a little while since I've done one, and it seems like that COVID blur, we were doing one of these every couple of weeks. So it's a privilege. It truly is. The amount of doctors I've had the pleasure of speaking with pre-pandemic, during, and if we call this post, has been pretty remarkable. So, you know, really the whole intent behind tonight's content is a fewfold, is a culmination of a lot of the top questions I get from yourselves, your peers, etc., really looking at the business. And, you know, again, I incredibly humbled of speaking to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dentists from coast to coast to coast to coast, from Honolulu to Halifax to Key West to Anchorage and everything in between. So really a lot of the questions we get and a lot of the concerns we get, quite frankly, are, what are you seeing, Eric? What are some of the trends? How do I protect myself? And my God, we just went through this whirlwind. And if I'm not the first person to tell you, if you haven't had a consult with us yet, but you know, truly, if you haven't given yourself a good pat on the back for the past couple of years, you certainly deserve it. And look, as one business owner to yourselves, it's a time we never thought we'd go through. But the fact we've come to the far side and not only survive but thrive is a true testament. So again, lots of people have joined in, so let's jump in. First of all, again, keeping things pretty interactive here, guys. I'll pull up a quick poll here, if you can see that in front of you. So just to get a bit of a sense of your view of where you're at today. So we've got some great content for those of you that are owning your own building, contemplating owning your own building, or those of you that are in the lease today. So the first question of our quick intro poll, and again, those won't be publicized, I'll just share the percentages. Do you own or do you lease your space? Number one. And then number two, the situation. And we'll cover a lot of specific situations depending on the situation that you're coming through. So we'll help to customize some of the content this evening. So, hey, I'm to the stage now that I'm contemplating making the investment, right, and open or relocating a practice. I see a number have just clicked on, great. Number two is, you know what? Maybe valuations were nuts and hopefully valuations are coming down and you're contemplating acquiring a practice. Great, we'll touch on that. There's been a lot that have done it very profitably, and there are those that have made some missteps that I'm happy to, touch on some best practices on. Especially because, wow, valuing practices. I'm doing a CE course down in Orlando coming up pretty soon, and very interesting to see, right? A lot of those that were planning to buy are now planning to build, right? Valuations are coming back down, but interest rates are coming up. It's a really interesting times that we're seeing. And in a lot of cases, it's caused a lot of doctors to take pause. But at the same time, we've seen a large amount really take that Rockefeller glass half full approach and really contemplating how to leverage this, perhaps uncertainty, right? What did the Feds parlay today? Tesla was up 5% today, but you know what? The Dow crashed last week. It's, gosh, by the time we get away from our patients, it's hard to keep up. So really, tonight is a nice open conversation about what some of the trends are, what are some best practices, and what are some key tangible things to do as it pertains to the office lease principally, right? But what can be done across the board and holistically to drive some profit, right? And growth in 2023 and beyond. So just to share, we got about 5% planning to open or relocate, about 14% planning to acquire, another 27 contemplating selling. So a lot of the recent examples are perfect for you. And the largest amount, number 36%, hey, I'm just thinking of Eric staying put, but how do I help to leverage the fact that most, not all, but most landlords have finally listened to what we've been screaming about for 29 years now, which is that you, doctors, are the best tenants on the planet. The best. Highest build-out costs, upwards of $300 per square foot these days, sometimes more in San Francisco right now, close to 400. Lowest default rates, 0.5%, when a restaurant's almost the complete opposite. Right. Also, you're bringing in high quality foot traffic. The practice is in the same location for 26 and a half years. Right. And don't believe me, but you're COVID proof. There's not a single dentist that's been able to work from home. So for the 35% of you that are staying put, we'll touch on some great techniques and go from there. So managing growth, we want to touch on. So this is interesting. Right now, based on the selections, a few people are changing votes here, but investing in new technology right now, 28% of you are contemplating the investment in new technology and equipment. Fantastic. That can be a great avenue to do so. Be cautious about what and where. Obviously, I'm a little myopic as it pertains to the facility and the lease. But in some cases, especially any alterations or anything to bring in a contractor, or a lot of the panels are actually being drilled into some of the structural beams without the footings anymore. Some really neat equipment, but again, just double check what's in your lease in terms of those alterations. From that perspective, renovations, about 10% of you. Expanding into the adjacent suite, about 5%, 4 or 5%, which is interesting because if you're contemplating relocation, as 8% of you are, you know what? There might even be an opportunity to look to your left, look to your right, or look behind you. Is there an adjacent suite that you can move into? Recent example, we moved a dry cleaner for a doctor, and they were able to move into the adjacent suite. So they kept their initial 5 operatories, saved hundreds of thousands of dollars, and stationary and picking up and relocating and the new build out. And the doctor had the flow exactly they wanted. It was just being able to add another 4 ops plus a break room plus a treatment room plus a doctor's office in that next door space. Perfect. 12 of you, right, hunkering down, not growing, and then obviously a large number of you with leases expiring within 2 years, 32%, 2 to 5. About a good handful are owning, and a number of you don't have a lease, contemplating next steps, which is great. And interestingly, another 20% looking to start or build a practice. So, all right, on that note, let's jump in and let's go. So appreciate it, right? From that perspective, let's jump in. So for those of you that haven't joined us before, quick purpose process payoff this evening are really some of the top growth and profit questions we get, which is, Eric, I'm about to open a new practice. Should I buy my own real estate? And that can be a great question, which we'll dig into. Or should I potentially, I'm not too sure, but the area, I live out of the city, I'm doing a big commute. You know what, how deep should I go, and what's it worth for the flexibility of a lease? Number two is, again, for those of you that own, we'll touch on some of those components. And we'll also touch on what we've learned now 29 years in the business, what we've learned specifically on how to drive profit, which is twofold, right? First of all, it's driving production and protecting your production, which we'll touch on through the office lease. In addition to that, it's looking at it all the way through the eventual sale and transition. And then it's also looking at things like personal guarantees and looking at what your individual exposure is, which, of course, after all that hard work, the last thing you want to do is being blindsided by something. So we'll touch on some of the 8 steps to a very successful lease negotiation, right? And how to maximize your profit. We'll touch on the 7 financial variables. Hey, when everybody thinks of lease negotiation, Eric, we're just driving down rent, we're just reducing annual increases, but there's really so much more to that. And there's a lot of other levers that some of you may be shocked to know what landlords may be willing to do for you. Those of you obviously at early career to transitioning, we'll touch on some of those growth pieces, and then also touch on some best practices. I know we have those that are in a multi-site situation or at 2 or 3 and looking to go to 6 to 9. And as one of the faculty members of Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute, as well as York University as a mini MBA specifically for dentists, as one of the other faculty members there, I look forward to sharing some of those great best practices. Again, the goal is not to make us industry experts here this evening, but to really help to reframe how important the lease, the location, right, as well as your long-term goals are for your long-term success. So again, hundreds of doctors register. I see we've got lots of you online, and again, great to see some friendly faces. For those of you that just joined, Q&A and the notes are open beside me here. Happy to keep things interactive if it's on track. I'll answer some questions as we go. It can be done anonymously. And again, we'll keep things pretty interactive, and then there'll be a Q&A section towards the end. For those of you that haven't joined us before, welcome. This is again, true privilege. We've pretty unique. We're the only healthcare specialized tenant advisory firm of our kind in North America. This is it. This is all we do. 13,000 lease negotiations. We've got incredible members of our team. Some have been negotiating office leases now for over 20 years. Others we've got with over 10 years worth of vintage. And interestingly, some that used to work on the landlord side negotiating against dentists, we've now hired on board from the dark side to now represent the dentist. So we've truly seen all 360 degrees. So pleasure doing some CE courses like this as well. All right, so the first off is the facts. So what are some of the steps, those 8 steps we touched on before? What are some great ways to help maximize your profit? Well, the first piece is, and I can't share it enough, is the data. And just knowing if it comes down to marketing and demographics, right? What is the growth for your area? Is your patient growth equivalent to the population or household growth within a 1 mile or a 3 mile radius of the practice? We have that data. One of the major investments that we've done into Cirrus over the past few years is to dramatically increase our data set. So for those of you wondering what rental rates are, we also have demographics. Feel free, at the bottom left-hand corner, guys, I added our core email address, goes to info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. If you've been curious about your local demographic report, rental rates, vacancies, I got the operations and real estate analytics team to pull some of these before tonight. But if you're curious now, one of the great components now for capitalizing on that growth is to have the data, right? Some of those demographics. How much is the population near you investing in healthcare, right? What is some of the growth that you've been seeing as well? Is it on par to the growth? What about If you're planning on doing some more orthodontistry, for example, and you want to do more Invisalign, or they're more young professionals, or if you're looking more for phase 1, phase 2, or potentially bringing in a specialist now, right? What is that population in those early teen years? As I had my neck gear, headgear, palate extender, elastic bands, and everything else, Dr. Sim, my incredible orthodontist and a 2-time past client of Cirrus, right, took great care of me over the years. So for those of you in my old hometown in beautiful southern California, interesting trend lines as we look at vacancy rates versus rental rates and some of those trends. New York, obviously, big transitions, no different than some of the major downtown areas that really had a big shift from COVID. And certainly we're still seeing some of those ramifications today. Down at the Yankee, we'll be at the Yankee Dental Conference. Good to see you. We'll be there as we look at vacancy rates versus market rates. They're at the Boston, New England market, Houston, Texas. Again, interesting trends. As soon as that COVID hit in 2020, some dramatic shifts and some slow leveling out. But again, for the graphs, not going to come together in quite some time. Atlanta, Orlando, well, where I'll be coming up here shortly, right? Interesting fluctuations, a little more resilient to what we saw in COVID. For those of you north of the border, we have Toronto, which has gone through some significant supply and demand challenges, especially in the downtown core, right? And Vancouver, which historically was an incredibly hot market. Yet we have seen some of that suburbanization as a lot of Toronto or otherwise people are moving out to the outskirts, right? And that downtown financial traffic or otherwise has not come back. So again, if you're interested, feel free, email us at that info@Cirrus Consulting Group. Happy to pull some of those quick reports for you. Or at the end, you can request that rent analysis and complimentary lease review. From that perspective, just a little summary there in the bottom right-hand corners, you can see some of those market conditions. And we track this pretty darn closely in terms of your specific property or submarket for a similar 3 to 5 star building. Looking at the market overall, right? How has that trended? How has that trended since the last time you did your lease negotiation? And even seeing potentially whom else might have signed on a lease, who might have moved in, and in some cases, we can even see the actual lease information coming from others. Great question for those looking for charts a little larger. Unfortunately, I can't make it any bigger on the screen, especially if you're joining with mobile. But again, feel free to email us and we can certainly set up a time and pull up your specific reports for you. So, all right, let's talk profit. So profits are a few-fold. Number one, don't allow it to be the dirty word. I can't share with you how many times doctors feel, let it be a guilt. It's a really interesting psychology behind it. Many of you may feel that because you've been very profitable, you've led very successful careers, you've been able to amass significant amount of success and wealth to support your family and your staff, and you've been incredibly generous. And notwithstanding the recent staffing challenges, right? I can't tell you how many feel a sense of, well, gosh, my landlord's been okay to me. I guess I will pay that 10% increase in rent, or I guess I'll pay a little more. I guess it's just my penance almost, right? It's almost my penalty for being as successful as I am. And boy, I really don't want to disturb any of that. So you know what? I'll just pay the landlord what I want. I can't share with you how passionate that makes me, because don't feel that way. And quite frankly, so many of you don't think that way anymore post-COVID. What did we see with COVID? Well, as soon as all the shuts down occurred, suddenly then many of you laid off your staff, and yet the landlord, some of you even got a default notice. A doctor on the East Coast got a default notice in an inside strip mall. The day after the state and provincial lockdown occurred, they got a letter that said, we know, notwithstanding the lockdown, but we have seen that you've got a locked door, and per your lease, you're in default, and here's all the nasty things. So the first thing to really share here is the viewpoint now. There should be a level of anger is not the right word, but let's use anger, right? As you laid off your staff, you suddenly realize, why am I still responsible for paying rent? In some cases, there was different federal or provincial types of incentives at the time, of which the landlord had to apply for, and many doctors didn't even have the landlord go through the process. Why? Because they give up 25%, even though it would save you over 75% on those months of rent. So a lot of doctors now have taken a different approach and said, darn it, next time that lease review comes around, I'm going to make sure that I am getting the best possible deal aligned to how great of a tenant I am. Eric, I've paid my rent on time like clockwork, right? If there's been an issue, I called the plumber, I called the electrician, I covered it myself out of my business, right? You know what? I didn't even want to bother the landlord with it, right? Or suddenly, you know what? As soon as COVID came around and I wanted a little help, the landlord wouldn't even pick up my phone. Or the landlord, great idea, the landlord sent an email to all 100 people asking for some rent help, and suddenly said, great, send me your last 3 years worth of financial statements. Oh, whoa, hey, okay, no problems, Mr. Landlord. No, I'll just go away. However, if your lease specifically said that you're required to send them financial statements, right, that also is something to look at, because that could also, and has led to some doctors into some default situations. So on the profit side, the financial pieces, here are 7 key. If you joined the webinar I did with Kelly, one of our lease negotiators recently, she really touched on all of the levers. These are just 7. There's probably 20 or 30 different components that, hidden within page 76 of 104 of your lease agreement, are areas that are money out of pocket. Let it be for replacing a new HVAC system on top of the roof that you might not have even realized is your responsibility, to a requirement within your lease to make sure that you are responsible for maintaining that HVAC system, which is another interesting component. And if not, then not only the replacement, but also any damages, etc., can be your responsibility as well. So the big ones, of course, are base rent, annual increases, and common area maintenance. Let me pause on CAM, because CAM is something that so often gets overlooked, yet especially in these new beautiful strip malls, can be upwards of 50+%, 50+%. So for the 32% of you thinking of opening a new clinic, please be aware that that base rent there is so much more lying beneath that iceberg that is called common area maintenance, which can include taxes, maintenance, and insurance. And within that maintenance can be a whole cornucopia of other expenses. Let it be 15% management fees I saw the other day, plus another 5% administration fee, plus another annual increases, plus paying for real estate or brokerage or legal fees for units that don't even have anything to do with yourself, right? So the common area maintenance fee can be another beautiful way of helping to reduce or protect your overhead expenses, to make sure that as we're into this inflationary type of environment with higher interest rates, think about it. You've got all these landlords now that are carrying debt, right? And it'd be interesting to find out how much your landlord is paying in debt. But if they have significant debt service and they bought a few years ago, etc., right? They might have bought when money was almost free, right? 1, 2+%. Now suddenly 6, 7, who knows? So think about it. Look at your specific building, look at your left, look at your right, and say, look, if the landlords suddenly their fees are going up by $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in terms of mortgage and interest expense, etc., right? Who do you think they're going to make pay? Right? Is it the florist that might still be behind in rent from COVID, right? Or is it the successful dentist that's been up and running there for the past 5, 10, 15 years? So CAM becomes a big component to be aware of, right? And ideally even have some audit rights. So your financial and accounting team can review it to make sure that everything is up and up, everything's been accounted for, right? And that you're paying to what's been described within your lease. Now, I'll talk about some of the cake and eat it too strategy, and I'm going to go through some examples here, which for the many of you online, you'll see some great components. Again, Q&A, feel free to throw it on or note section as we go, and we'll cover some questions through there. But you would be amazed to know, and I share this knowingly because there's many landlords that have offered an incredible package for new doctors to relocate their existing practice to a new location. So one of the main strategies to drive your profit, let alone growth, but is to have your cake and eat it too. Help to make sure you clearly understood what your rent, what your renewal looks like to stay. What are they willing to do to keep you? And then the flip side is heck, just to keep them honest. What's the landlord willing to offer you down the street to potentially relocate the practice, right? And then also, they have a number of ways of doing that. They can either give you a price per square foot and help to reimburse you from those expenses, or number two, they can actually build it out for you using their contractors at their expense. So let's look at some recent examples. Don't take my word for it. Here's some recent ones. So this was one down Southern California. Client came to us contemplating renewal, right? But realized that just from some initial conversations and dangling a new 10-year term, we quickly found out that the landlord wanted to redevelop, wanted to put something else in that space. We're in a different layout for the plaza. And needless to say, we quickly found out that this may not be and is not looking like a great long-term home. So that's a tough decision, right? What would you do? If suddenly you realize your landlord, new landlord now, sold and had other plans for you, the building, right? What would you do? Does it make sense to move now, or does it make sense to be the last person, on the sinking ship, before it goes down, to then move afterwards? Well, this doctor decided, hey, look, let's at least see what the options are. So again, had to make the decision to either do a short-term renewal, move now, but ultimately the move was going to be inevitable. So interestingly, client ended up moving to and relocating to a different building, not too far away. Landlord then agreed to build out the practice and contribute over $153,340 towards the client's practice. Not everything, but certainly a welcome amount to help lessen that blow. But a big piece now is this doctor now got to build it out to their own objectives, build it out to be left hand specific, which was an issue before, but even on top of that, the landlord was willing to kick in over $45,000 worth of free rent, was able to then secure a 10-year term with 2 5-year options, which was important for the doctor who's contemplating selling in the next 10 to 15, for an 1,800 square foot space. So a great, perfect example. So for any of you on the fence, or the 22% of you that were contemplating either expanding or potentially relocating, don't underestimate your value to that landlord down the street, and certainly don't take that initial offer. I've seen some scenarios with a doctor that was a very first practice, very first lease, and was all set to sign that very first component, and it was at the listed. It was like walking into a car dealership and saying MSRP is $99,000 and saying, okay, I'll sign the $99,000. He was explained by the landlord that he'd also have 3 months worth of free rent. Well, it wasn't 3 months of free rent. It was 3 months tacked on to the end of the lease, which was actually going to increase the broker commission on it anyways. Needless to say, all sorts of twists and turns, but as a great recent case study to share, here was a situation where the doctor suddenly found out that their long-term home was going to change. Had to make the decision, but at least got all the facts to say, look, here's the pros and cons to stay, and here's what the landlord's willing to do. And heck, you know what? For $45,000 of helping me reduce my overhead for the first few months and expenses, with $153,000 in tenant improvement allowance, and now I've got a long-term solution that I can sell. My God, boy, was this doctor glad they moved now versus towards the end portions of their career. Another example I had shared before was a personal client of mine. You can see her 5-star Google review. I've referenced it in the past. She was 73, and after practicing for decades, when she tried to sell, the landlord said no. 3 separate times. Why? Because the landlord wanted to move into her space. And therefore, right, there it was in Article 62, subsection 4 of the assignment and subletting provision that stated that the doctor could not sell their practice, well, obviously could not assign the lease, rather, right, without the successful, and that the sale was predicated on the successful assignment of the lease. Right. So basically, if the landlord didn't allow the lease to be assigned, right, unfortunately, the value of that practice was diminished to basically nothing. So there she was. She reached out to us. We found a location about 10 minutes north. It was just a great win-win-win. But can you imagine being 73 years of age and being forced to relocate your clinic purely because the landlord said no? So if there's even a wisp of chance of a demolition or relocation provision, or even if the landlord's not willing to give you term or options, that's all red flags, right? And you might think, oh, you know what, Erica, my landlord, I love them, they're fantastic. That never happened to me. I can remember another example in Woodland Hills where the doctor, was his golfing buddy, sold the building without a lease in place. The new buyers came through, put up a brand new lease in front of him just before he's planning to retire with personal guarantees, meaning if the landlord had any dispute or damages, etc., they could go after him personally, and he even made him continually liable. So even after the practice sold, he would still be remaining on the hook. And this was a doctor in the late 60s that was just almost ready to throw the keys into the ocean to say, I'm done. Another example, speaking of the ocean, right? One in the middle of the ocean here was a doctor that was mid-career, new practice, purchasing, and as a result, right, the doctor was looking to take over a deceased purchase and sale, right? And just as a great example was, again, great money from the landlord, great new location, lots of free rent, and a great 10-year term with multiple options. For those in the Yankee Dental Conference coming up, this was a simple example that, hey, doctor was going through to renew the lease. Landlord wanted an 11% bump. We're seeing this a lot, by the way. We're seeing landlords push for 10, 12, 16, 20+% increase in rent. Why? Because they feel they can. And quite frankly, they can easily say, look, my debt service, the amount of money they're spending in interest on their mortgage, no different than what you're doing with your house, is the landlord's not paying for it on their own. They got to collect it somewhere. The goal is that it doesn't come from you, right? That you can protect yourself for as long as possible, right? Minimizing those expenses. But here's a great example. Landlord said, we're renewing, we want 11% increase. Right. So we went through the process and completely turned things upside down, where we were able to get the lease not only not increasing the 11%, but actually the same for year one, right? And then only a 3% thereafter. So what are some strategies that are working? CPI is great, right? CPI to a maximum of 3% is even better. So you've sort of protected your angles on both sides. Does that happen every time? Of course not, right? In many cases, 3% right now is actually a little less than average. We're seeing a lot of landlords being asking for 4%, right? Sometimes 5%. But again, if we want to have our cake and eat it too, CPI, right, with a cap of X percentage helps to protect on both sides. So if it's lower, all the benefit. Might be quite some time before we get back below 3% again, but you never know. Your guess is as good as mine, right? But again, that helps with those annual increases, and I'll touch on a practical example here shortly. So $37,000 in rent just over that 5-year term with 2 5-year options, and most importantly, they're transferable. So when you do go to sell, right, it's important to look at your lease through the buyer's eyes. So for the 32% of you that are contemplating selling in the next 5 to 10 years, don't be selfish. I know you want to be, right? However, please start looking at the lease through the buyer's eyes. Is the use provision predicated and specific to you? Are you an orthodontist, right, that also is running a general, practice, but suddenly there's another doctor who has exclusivity over the subspecialty of orthodontistry, basically preventing you from phase 1, phase 2, Invisalign or otherwise, right? So these are the type of things to be considering, specifically as you're now contemplating selling, and maybe you don't like orthodontistry, but if your buyer is going to be coming in and they're the ones paying you the $2 million for the practice, right? And suddenly your lease prevents you from doing some of those specialties or subspecialties because someone else negotiated exclusivity, that's a problem. So good questions there. In addition, another practical example, right? Here was an existing, again, a client quite nervous through the processes. We went through the example of, again, looking at what would it be to stay versus what would it be to move to a different building. In this case, the landlord amazingly paid the sole cost of the build out, right, to the doctor's specifications, roughly $250,000. The only exception was plumbing and cabinetry. Fantastic example, right? Month of free rent, as well as moving a fixturing, right? So we had a month just to move, even though it might be over the weekend, got a month of free rent for that, 10-year term, 2 5-year options, and great pertaining to the eventual sale. Okay, so this should be nice and large for everybody. Again, feel free to throw in some Q&As as we go. So this is just the math. Grab your calculators, right? Or phones in this case, right? And nice 5-star Google review from Jim. That was nice. Jim, if you're joining, thank you for that. Third time using Cirrus. With that being said, grab your calculators, put in the specific amount of your monthly rent, multiply by 12, and then just multiply by 1.03 or 0.04 or 0.05, whatever your annual increase is. And that's what I've done here, is basically take that 60,000, increasing it by 3% per year. And if you click equals, 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 this is what it'll come up with. So looking at that, sort of like the notion of compounding interest, because it's now an increase on the increase on the increase. So in the first practical example, $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year, you're $687,000 just over the first 10 years alone. Now, you might think that's not too bad. However, right, very important to start to look at your option to renew language. And in your options, does it specifically say that your lease will never be less than the 10th year of your lease negotiation? So one of the things that we want to ideally strive for is the ability to reset and renegotiate at that time. If there's been a dramatic shift in rental rates, vacancies, etc., you want the ability to renegotiate or arbitration, etc. There's a bunch of components there. But let's just assume, right, between 10 years ago and then shortly afterwards, you got a bump from 78,000 to 85,000 a year. Not too bad, you say. But suddenly now, when looking at it, that's suddenly now $974,000, right? And then over 20 years, that's a $1.6 million check. So for the many of you that are contemplating either buying or building, don't for a second fall into the trap where the landlord says, oh yeah, here's a 2-page amendment. Good news, you're X amount per square foot. Congratulations, sign here. What a beautiful business being a landlord. You suddenly are just, reducing the ridiculous down to the price per square foot. And you know what? Yeah, we went up, 25 cents per square foot. We went up $1 per square foot, right? But suddenly now, when the way that they account for it, with their accountants are looking at it now as basically you just gave a check, the largest check that you'll send to anyone personally and professionally, right, through your professional career. So again, ask yourself, if you're about to sign or re-sign the lease, are you getting that value as if you're signing a $1.6 million check? Great components. And then also, right, most of you will be in that same location, even if it's your second location, third location, etc. Look at that, just into year 21 through year 30, right? That totals to now $2.9 million. right? Now, your revenue obviously far exceeds that. And this might only be the national average of 8.32% of your annual revenue going towards your tenancy expense. But my whole point behind this is every penny counts, and fighting tooth and nail for all of those 7 main financial variables can cascade into the hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings, especially looking at 10, 15, 20 plus years. So big takeaway there as it pertains to your growth and profit. It's so much easier to grow when you've got the capital to do so, right? So to do so, the best thing to do is to really recognize the importance of the lease, calculate your total financials, right? Heck, you can email your accountant or your bookkeeper otherwise and say, by the way, how much have I spent now over the past 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? And more importantly, now what's on the threshold? And for those of you contemplating selling, what a beautiful opportunity to be renegotiating rent. I'm reminded of a doctor we did not too long ago in Vista, California. We were able to get a 32% rent reduction when she went to renew her lease. Right now, of course, does that happen every day? Of course not. Right, but it was a typical example where, right, the doctor bought a practice. Right, the previous doctor had taken a bunch of money from the landlord, which then, unfortunately, just was built in to the rent, which then kept on going up and up and up, renewed the lease, up and up and up, renewed the lease again, up and up and up, and suddenly was dramatically above market. So negotiating these leases back to market price is key. All right. So great conversations here with myself. In the essence of time, let's cover a couple of these additional components. So really, managing the lease is a great component. The best thing I can suggest for you now with those of you that have a lease in here today is, first and foremost, put in your calendar, when does my lease expire? And then more importantly, when is if you have one, an option to renew deadline? What is the critical date that you need to advise the landlord of your intent to stay? And if you don't serve notice, then your remaining 2 5-year options become null and void. The next big piece are preparing. What are you doing to prepare for your next negotiation? As a lot of the dental suppliers will ask, doctor, how are you preparing for your next lease? And unfortunately, most doctors come back and say, I don't know, I'm so busy chairside, I haven't even thought about it. I don't even know when it comes up for renewal. I really should look. Right? You're chairside. The best value for your time is to be chairside, right? For practicing wet finger dentistry. But the second best is to make sure that you're getting the best value for what you have. So looking at what you're paying for, we talked about base rent, but then what's all that annual increase? And quite frankly, what's in your common area maintenance? How is that broken down? Do you have audit rights? And about this time of year, some of you might be getting a significant true up, or in essence, an increase. If you've been paying $4,000 a month for your CAM fees, and suddenly you get an extra bill for an extra $5,000, $10,000, not uncommon because their costs, the landlord costs, have been higher, right? And there's that true up at the end of the year. If you do get those, please reach out. Happy to have a look and sort of compare those for you. And last but not least, the exit, right? Is your lease assignable, right? And what concerns would a practice broker have when it actually comes down to your assignability? With that being said, here's quick chart. But ultimately, I know there's only a handful that own their own buildings. For those of you contemplating potentially buying a building, it can be a great idea, right? Everybody can make money in real estate as long as you live long enough, as they say. However, the importance of the dental office lease remains the same. If you're contemplating buying versus building, right, there's a lot of considerations you want to have. At a very high level, is you want to start thinking about your long-term goals. When you look at a lot of these big dental incs, DSOs, etc., very few of them are interested in the real estate. So for those of you that might own your building and own your practice, typically 9 times out of 10, they just want your practice. Why is that? Well, for the most part, it's because of the fact that access to capital and cost of debt. Why would they want to Why would they want to tie up their cost of capital, right? Their ability, access to capital, when they could buy a piece of real estate, or if they could go buy another practice or two practices, right? So most of the multi-sites don't want to own the real estate because of that ability, the return rates, the profit margins, right? The ability to package them up for eventual sale, the multiples of EBITDA you might have heard, right, can be higher, especially with the more practices you own, right? So that's a big piece. The next question is that a lot of doctors prefer to lease as they're building out their first practice or buying, is again, there's that ability to expand into the adjacent suite, but not necessarily have to pay for it, right? That can be done through things like a right of first refusal, a right to purchase, or other components that allows you to expand into the adjacent space. So, if you're into a nice building and maybe there's a convenience store or a music store or who knows next to you, right? There might not be there forever. Could be a great opportunity to deal with a landlord that, or even in the lease, giving you the contractual ability to potentially expand if you do have immediate plans to do so. Is this the location that you love? Or, I had the example the other day of a doctor that built two, right? A beautiful, beautiful multi-million dollar, bought the building, spent another $1 million retrofitting it. And suddenly now we're commuting almost an hour and a half each way. And now coming to the realization that, oh my goodness, I think I made a mistake. So really make sure that the location you're looking at, you're in love with, right? If some of your partners move away or back out, etc., you really want to make sure that you've got the business case to ensure that what's the best case scenario for patients, what's the worst case scenario for patients, and really how long can I float myself? And in this particular case, the doctor's, working for free just to try to work off this mortgage. So it's a core component. Access to capital is a big one, right? What happens if that mortgage renews? And again, what stage of a career are you? For the most part, most financial advisors will advise to start with a lease, right? Minimize your expenses, pay off your student loan, pay off your practice loan. Then once you've built things up, then look at a satellite or second location, or look at buying and then relocating. But there's been lots of examples where, gosh, I bought this plot of land and suddenly zoning and in costs, and suddenly other partners wanted to do it with me, didn't want to do it anymore. So, and then think about what your plan is for your eventual property transition, right? What's best for you in the long term? And those are all the types of things to think of. Some other components here are, again, how are you contemplating that growth and that potential real estate decision? Part of it is the market, right? What are you seeing here today? What is the age of building that you're in today or contemplating moving into, right? What upgrades are required? It's what's that old Chevy Chase movie, right? The old house where they're renovating it, Shelley Long, and it all falls apart. It's just an absolute nightmare. You want to be cautious. That can equally occur by buying $1 million building, and suddenly there's asbestos issues or there's zoning issues or all sorts of things that can create a massive issue down the line. What's that liability, right? Heaven forbid something were to happen to you. What's your ability to get the exit, right? How much is your building worth, right? Without you and your practice in it. Is it going to cost you more to remove all the dental equipment if you can't find another dentist to move in? Type of building, right? Is it a single or multi-tenant? If you're thinking of buying something and it already has tenants in it, that's a whole other kettle of fish, right? When some partners had bought a building, suddenly then the elevator needed to fly in a new compressor units for the air conditioner, right? The elevator broke down, all sorts of issues can occur. Be prepared for another part-time or full-time job if you now become a landlord as well. So for those of you that are, right, or about to be your own landlord, right, a couple of best practices we've seen over the years, especially in a post-pandemic environment. Write it as if you're the landlord, not the tenant. So many doctors, download something from the internet and put as favorable terms as possible. You might think that's great. However, right, think about it from your buyer's perspective. what's better for them to say, look, here's the lease I've been using and paying for myself for the past 15 years, and I'm just assigning it to you, right? Or upon purchase and sale, suddenly, oh, here's your new lease, congratulations, and the ink is still wet, right? So in our experience, keep your financials clean, separate your two entities from your real estate corporation, from your practice corporation, right? And be conscious and writing that lease as if it's for the future buyer. Right? Let it be rental rates, let it be CAM fees, let it be alterations, etc. It might just be easier to pay yourself whatever the mortgage is, but you got to be cautious, right? CRA, IRS, etc. Right? Suddenly, if there's a big variance between what you're paying for in fair market rent versus what you're responsible for, or what you're actually paying yourself for, can be a significant concern. Lots of questions in the essence of time, again, to really ask about yourself and your situation, both on the leasing side and if you own. But you really want to be thinking about, for those of you doing it for the first time, be aware of your wills and estate planning. Right? Realize that it's just as important to have the will for your assets as it is for your liabilities. I was just in about 5 hours visiting my aunt who recently suffered a stroke and passed away. And again, the mortgage, and now through probate, it's just as important to be what her contractual lease and other obligations are, right? Versus what the assets are. And then the net is whatever's left over is unfortunately what's left. So ultimately, again, the importance of that for those building owners, important for all of these components to make sure that you've got a key plan and a key structure as looking forward. As we wrap up through and looking through growth, be aware of those key dates, right? Be aware of the specific clauses within the lease, right? And be aware of what's specifically within those clauses. And that's where we'll go into a quick practical example. So how do we structure this to maximize risk and minimize risk and maximize profit? So this is one example, and we've seen just some horror stories come across the desk where, oh my gosh, my landlord was my good friend, and I thought they were my good friend, and suddenly now they sent me an email that I didn't renew my lease, or the landlord's, making life incredibly painful for me, and in some cases, they're not even returning my calls. So let's take a quick section here to look over this one particular clause, and let's see if we can identify some of these particular red flags. Great to see some familiar names. Again, the Q&As are open. As we're in person, I usually ask for a show of hands to see how many actually enjoy reading the lease. So what did we find here first, guys? On a beautiful Monday night, this is interesting, right? Provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, full stop. So again, what benefit is this to your buyer? Zero, right? This can be written in a number of ways. This could be written in as long as the trade name is your specific trade name, Dr. Joe Black Dentistry. This could be specifically as the name tenant, but you do want to make sure that this is fully transferable to your buyer, and having those options. Most banks, especially the major banks in the US, typically, if there's insufficient term on the lease, they will not issue a long-term loan payback period to the buyer. Meaning that if you go to sell your clinic and you're year 9 of a 10-year term and you have 2 5-year options, but they're not assignable, right? Or maybe there's only 4 years left on your lease, right? Many banks will raise the red flag and to say, I don't know, I don't feel good about giving a 12-year term when there's only 5 years of assurance that you're still going to be in that same location. What did you notice here? This basically took all the hard work you did through any previous lease renewal and throw it out the window. I saw this the other day. Any such renewal shall be at the landlord's current standard form lease. Well, great. So that means that landlord sells, new landlord comes in, multinational, they throw whatever the lease in front of you, and at that point, right, comes a much more difficult situation. Better yet, secure a new lease now before the landlord sells, and they all are flipping like Monopoly pieces these days, right? And look out for some of these. Here it is, hidden in Article 76. In no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term, meaning that you're on the world's most boring roller coaster. It's only going in one particular direction, right? Or this little trick, which is that if it's a new strip mall, etc., and suddenly everybody's paying these astronomical face rates because the landlord provided all this, tenant improvement money or otherwise, but it just raised the actual rate for the building. Well, suddenly, what good is that? Rising tides raises all ships, but it also raises all overhead. So be cautious of linking your rent to any of the others in the building. Now, you'll never get to know what the others are paying, right? But the landlord does, and they've got the language. So one little clause here, as you can imagine, can have all sorts of issues to your eventual profitability event, which is when you go to sell, right? So as we go through here, I've got one other example. We'll cover some Q&A, one that just came through. Let me see if it's on topic here. So I'll pause on that one actually, because I'll come back to that. It's about purchasing the building, but again, feel free, Dr. A, to add any additional questions through there. So the assignment section. Quick look. In the essence of time, I'll break things down. So really one of the first here is that you cannot sell your practice without the landlord's prior written consent. That might shock you, but that is in virtually every single lease, with the only exception for the lease that doesn't talk about it, or even worse, says the tenant cannot, under any circumstances, assign or sublet the lease premises. So again, the eventual sale of your practice will be predicated on either A, the buyer getting, right, conditional on the buyer getting financing, or B, the successful assignment of that lease, right? Number two is, be cautious of this. We're seeing this a lot more often now. The landlord, just for asking, the landlord shall have the option to A, approve your buyer, B, decline your buyer and basically kill your sale, or number three, not only say no, but actually terminate your lease on the date that you were going to close, sell your clinic, buy the boat, right, and move down to the islands, all through the lease. Imagine the impact to your long-term profitability, right, when suddenly that eventual practice sale proceeds gets eradicated. Be cautious, be prepared, and be aware of what's within your lease, right? This is unique, right, where the landlord can actually adjust the rent. This scares away a lot of buyers. I did a great webinar not too long ago with Dr. Tom Schneider, one of the heads for Henry Schein's Dental Practice Transitions team, who shared one of the most recent issues as to why so many deals are dying, practice deals are dying at the 11th hours because of the rent, right? This little language, in the essence of time, I won't go through in nauseam, but basically enables the landlord to a percentage of your practice sale proceeds. If you don't believe me, talk to some of the top practice brokers, and they're seeing this more and more common lately, where the landlords are asking for money, payments, consideration. One recently, $160,000, right, from the seller to the landlord just to assign the lease when they were trying to sell it to a DSO. And arguably, as it pertains to maybe not profit, but perhaps profit of peace of mind, is notwithstanding to the landlord even allowing you to sell your practice and assign the lease. But, right, it states here that the tenant shall not be released of its ongoing liabilities, right? Let that be personal guarantees or continuing liability even after you have sold. So one little clause, right, Article 76 of your lease, again, could have hundreds of thousands of dollars of risk. Good news, extra hours, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to go through all of these clauses tonight. I'm kidding. For those of you running through, it's a great one to do a little screenshot of. These are just some of the ones we look at in terms of negotiability and what impact it has. In the essence of time, just be aware, or more importantly, as we review your lease, let's make sure that you're aware what obligations there are, and more importantly, what can be done to improve them. Please don't be a victim here. Start early. Our typical guidance is 2+ years prior to the lease coming up for expiry to start the process. The landlords, how do the landlords increase profit? Well, they watch courses like this, right? Hopefully not this one, but they learn a course. This is from one of their courses, which basically states that, look, forget about anything else. They can increase their profit without a penny of expense just by running out the clock on you, right? I'm busy, it's too soon, I'm golfing, I'm traveling, I can't respond, blah, 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 right? All of these components are basically adding the pressure to you, that as then you get closer to expiry date, your leverage decreases dramatically. So the more time you have, the more leverage, right? Start the process early, especially if you don't have any further options to renew. You have nothing left. There has to be a new lease in place, right? And drafting a nice proposal to the landlord might be a perfect opportunity to get them off the chair, especially if they're starting to get squeezed by their bankers and you name it. So as we wrap up here, 8 steps, 29 years that Cirrus has been helping doctors through the negotiations and renegotiations. Number 1, right? Gather all documentation, full stop. Number 2, identify the practice and career goals, right? Long before your very first step. Number 3, have your lease professionally reviewed. It is so important that you know exactly what's in your lease, what are the red flags, and more importantly, what's the range? What's the best case scenario, worst case scenario, right? And some of those step downs is what we deal with every single day. Number 4 is have the facts, right? If you haven't emailed us already, I haven't checked my email yet, but if anybody's emailed us at info, right, your local address, right, or through requesting the lease review, which I'll pull up here in a second, right? And most importantly, number 5, figure out what that carefully choreographed game of chess is and that very last move, right? And number 5, determine your output and strategy, but please don't walk into the practice tomorrow, pick up the phone and say, hey, Mr. Landlord, I just watched a webinar. What do you want to charge me next time? Don't skip those steps. Please follow through 1 step 5, do all the due diligence. Then what we do first is negotiating the financials, then the business clauses, and we don't stop until we've got a final executed form of lease. Whew. Some great questions that have come through. I'll get to those in a second. Again, just as we conclude, a lot of points, little pings here, specifically to some questions about making it easy. How do we help? So here's a quick, easy one. Again, if you do have a tenant with a lease, question number 1, right? For those of you that have been following behind or been following along, looking at your lease agreement, when does that lease expire? If you are in a month-to-month situation for number 3, please note urgent. I see a few urgents that have come through. And then again, for those of you that are concerned, right? Don't look, we've dare say seen it all. You're not alone in all of this, right? I know they never did a lease negotiation course at dental school, right? Quite frankly, you've been trained to be an excellent clinician. How often are you dealing with your dental office lease, for Pete's sakes, right? So again, appreciate it, right? 62% requesting a lease review thus far. It's a great hour to have a similar fireside chat about your life, your situations, your goals, your long-term plans, and quite frankly, more importantly, what that might look like, right? What's that best case scenario? What's a worst case scenario? And then more importantly, how can a firm like ours really help you bridge that gap, right? Versus spending the 30, 40, 50 hours, right? Figuring it out on your own. You're not alone in all of this. Right, we've been a proud partner of Shines. We appreciate their support for this evening, right? And basically, in appreciation of your time, we waive our $2,000 fee, right? And we do a complimentary lease review where a team will do the rental rate analysis, vacancies reports, etc., review your lease, and be able to make sure that you have a much better idea, a very concise negotiation treatment plan, and the options on how we can help to take some of the stress off your shoulders. Great, I'll keep that open for a moment here. Some great questions has just popped through. So again, Q&A is open. I'll cover these as we go. Again, to the charts, I'll make those, I'll pass on that feedback to our marketing team to make those larger. Again, the point of it was just to show a little bit of the breadth of data versus the individuals. If you've requested a lease review, Dr. L, we'll be able to, we can certainly pull those for you and share those. Dr. A, my office is in a shopping mall and the landlord is selling the shopping mall. Building I occupy is freestanding. Is it possible to separate the building from the whole shopping mall and buy only that building? Great question. In short, it depends. If it is freestanding, that's obviously better to your favor. The question, though, is really from the landlord. Would they get more by separating it, or would they be more based on it all being together? What does property line look like? What does parking look like, for example? Would the landlord, would the future landlord be okay with that being separate? In short, it's certainly worth an ask. Regardless, if they are thinking of selling, Dr. A, we should certainly have a look at your lease to look at what rights or responsibilities you have, especially if there's going to be a change of control or a sale. In some cases, better to negotiate with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. So, Dr. A, hopefully that answers your question here. Dr. C, great question. I'd like a complimentary lease evaluation. I'm in the process of relocating my office and waiting for a lease for a prospective office space. So great, yeah, happy to regroup for those. Another question about us versus local lawyer, etc. So, look, I think a good way to look at some of our largest clients describe us as really a great sweet spot to their professional team, right? Where, brokers have objectives very much of location finding and, negotiating core financials, and obviously paid for directly by the landlord, right? Built into your rent, obviously, right? And I think what makes us unique is really we're the sweet spot in between, where, there are great resources out there, but I think what makes us unique is the lawyers or otherwise that we have on staff are truly remarkable at what they do. And the fact that we're hyper specialized on dental office leases, no different than your profession, right? When we've done 13,000 of these, it does come with some great landlord reputation. It comes from great experience. We have an incredible team. So when the landlord says no, it does give us a great, cornucopia of support. And look, we work with lots of great M&A attorneys. Quite frankly, they're one of our big referral sources. Litigation attorneys got a great referral the other day, specifically because, hey, look, here's the one path, but actually maybe there's some middle ground here. So we were referred to be able to jump into a unique situation to help create a win-win situation versus going down, right, the longer road, shall we say. So Dr. C, hopefully that answered your question there, and Dr. L, Dr. A, etc. I know we've gone a little over time. Again, happy to, all my contact details are here. That rings the shoe phone and the office phone beside me here. Don't hesitate if there are some urgencies, questions, concerns. Hopefully tonight has been enlightening. I certainly appreciate your time, your questions, your candor, etc. Every situation, of course, is unique. And I really look forward to having a conversation with yourself and your professional team and helping to navigate, obviously, what is a major expense, and more importantly, help you and your team drive growth and drive some well-deserved profitability in 2023 and beyond. On that note, if there aren't any further questions, I truly appreciate everyone's time. I really enjoy these, and certainly wish everybody a fantastic evening, and looking forward to speaking to you all very soon. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a fantastic evening, and we will talk very soon. Thanks, guys.